What's up, YouTube? So I've had quite a few questions regarding Sesto Sento style leads, and it actually puzzles me how many people don't know this, but the guys behind the Sesto Sento project very many years ago, they're actually the same guys behind Vini Vici, I think minus one guy. Comparing the two groups' styles is actually quite interesting, and it's very indicative of how Psytrance has kind of changed over the years. You know, back in the kind of 2000s, early 2000s, when I think Sesto Sento was really at their peak, the major focus within kind of music production, and I think, and very much a strong point of their style, was their sort of MIDI progressions and arrangements and their kind of sequencing techniques. Whereas if you look at Vini Vici, I think it's very much the opposite. Their kind of focus and strong point is the sound design and the kind of minimal aspect, as opposed to something like Sesto Sento's very progression, sequence-based, uplifting kind of stuff. So the track that I've chosen as a kind of loose inspiration for this project that I created for this video is called Key to the Universe. Okay, so the reason I thought that would be such a good example is, you know, if you notice the way that the main lead, the actual sound itself is pretty simple. It's mainly saw waves, super saws, that kind of stuff, with very kind of simple effects, phases, and that kind of stuff, which, you know, I've discussed several times on my channel before. But I think the very interesting thing about that track, or about the way that the leads are created in that track, is the way that the sequences are progressing, you know. There's no two segments which kind of have the same melodic sequence. Even if it's kind of these subtle changes and stuff like that, it makes a huge difference to the overall progression of the track. And I think it's something that a lot of us get stuck with nowadays. You know, we create a cool kind of melody or a cool lead line, and, you know, we consider that the track done. Add a couple of cool sounds, and we have one hook, and then that's it. With these kind of older styles, a lot of the time, they had several hooks in the track that were very well kind of written around the sequencing and that kind of stuff, because obviously they didn't have the advanced software that we have nowadays to create these like really complex sounds and that kind of thing. So they relied very heavily on the MIDI and the sequencing. So like I said, I've very loosely based this project on that track. None of the sounds are exactly the same, but I feel like I've taken inspiration from the way that the sequences are kind of played out. And I don't want to go too in-depth with the sound design and that kind of stuff in this video. I want to discuss more, you know, how I came about, you know, figuring out these kind of like MIDI patterns and that kind of thing. And certain things that I think are special here that kind of add to the overall theme of the track. So first things first here, I think, you know, the most important thing, you know, that stands out about this track is the progression of the bass line. And, you know, that's the one thing that kind of stays the same throughout the whole track. And it sets the tone for this progression of these sequences and stuff like that. So there's a couple of things a little bit later which I'll get into, which kind of create tension, like I explained in a previous video. But for now, what I want to do is I just want to explore, you know, how this, how I actually came about creating. So let me just play it for you guys quick. So what I did there is I actually recorded a segment of the track out Oh, I hope I don't get a copyright strike for this. But you can clearly see that this is fair use. Anyway, so let's just remove these that we have here already. We can create some new ones. So what I want to do here is I want to take a frequency snapshot of each of those like progressions in the bass, if that makes sense. So let's just go. And then what you can do is you can just like solo them and look at like where the peak is and use that to kind of, or the peak of the first fundamental at least, or a couple of the other ones on further, depending on obviously how complex the actual sound is itself. So here, for example, we see that that fundamental is on either F or F sharp. It's hard to tell exactly, but the easy way then is to load up a synth, init it, and play the note while the track is playing to figure that out. So what we're going to do here is let's add a serum. So if you play the note while the track is playing, hopefully your ear can quickly tell whether it's in or out. So I'm pretty sure that that first note in the progression is an F sharp. We could quickly deduce that. And then it moves to a C sharp. It actually moves downwards there. No, I just got the frequency wrong. It moves upwards, I think, it moves up to an A. So what we can do is we can draw the notes in. Let's just see. F sharp. Okay, let's check out that frequency again, but let's just loop this section here and unmute this. It looks like it's a B, actually. Yeah, that sounds about right. So then what I did is, let's just mute this. And I want to compare those notes. So you'll see here it's F sharp, A, B, D. And let's just check out our bass progression that we made here. Just want to see that it's the same. Yeah. So you'll notice it starts on the low F sharp, and I've kind of created this. So it's like down, down, up, down, up, down, 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 up, down kind of pattern that like kind of, how can I say, alternates between those two with a variation every sort of sixth kick or so. And that creates this kind of rhythmic element to the bass line that I find really helps with these bass lines that have changing notes. Because often you're able to put in these kind of lower notes, you know, don't necessarily have the tone, but they've got the sub in them, and you use the higher notes to kind of like, to make it kind of more audible. So the progression here basically does the same as the notes that we just figured out in the previous example. Cool. So once I had figured out the kind of like root notes for that progression, it becomes a little bit easier to kind of write a melody around that, because now we have the kind of, you know, we know which notes we're allowed to kind of use at which parts. We're able to kind of deduce a scale from those notes. So let's actually just have a quick look at this. Let's say this is the root note. If we just transpose these all up to C, it makes it a little bit easier for me personally. I can quickly see that this is I believe that's a C minor scale. It's got the C, the D sharp, the F, and the G sharp. So I could quickly deduce that that's a C minor scale, or at least, excuse me, an F sharp minor scale. Or would it be a G flat? Let me know in the comments. So we're able to deduce the scale by just those 4 notes, which we figured out from the root note of the bass. And what we're able to do is then write a melody that's within the scale, and then using those kind of note placements, create these kind of like flourishes and, you know, more of a melodic sequence. So I'll get into a little bit more in depth with this lead over here. So here I've got this kind of like arpeggiator that I've created in the minor scale. And this was kind of like playing a repetitive sequence over and over again. And then I just duplicated that across over several bars and then shifted it up or down to fit. So let's just say, for example, I just actually want to delete all of these, and we can go back in and just move them. Just make this 16, just easier to see that way. And let's duplicate them all the way across. So correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that in terms of like the, you know, theory of it, that does still kind of work as an arpeggiator. However, I feel it doesn't quite have the same power as when you move it alongside that kind of progression of the bass. The main two notes, you know, in between these kind of leading notes here was the F sharp and I believe the B. And already immediately you've created this kind of major difference in energy for that section. So the interesting thing here is you could use, I believe this is called inversions, when you move the notes to different octaves while still maintaining a similar kind of shape or a similar, you know, structure. I do like when it goes high up like that. However, just keep in mind, you know, this is a great way of creating these kind of variations. You know, you could, for example, have this part at the end here, this leading part going into the upper octave. And similarly here, you know, so the bass line changes, but the kind of harmony of that top line doesn't change, just the inversion changes. So you're creating this like slight tension at the end before the note changes. But then another really interesting thing to do is to shift it to something that's still within the scale, but not exactly on those root notes. So I think in the original example, but I believe it went downwards. So So then doing stuff like this where you shift it to, you know, not necessarily on the same root note and stuff like that, where you're shifting this kind of sequence, there will be parts where certain notes are hitting off. So for example, here we shifted it up, I think 3 semitones, and now this note is now playing an F, but F is not actually in the scale. So what you want to do here is you want to shift it up or down until those exact notes are all kind of fitting within the scale that we deduced earlier. Okay, so just a quick rundown of the sound itself, if you guys are interested. It is just a bit of unison, a sharp kind of plucky sound, quite a bit of distortion, compression, phaser, and reverb. That's basically what's creating that sound. Okay, so for this part, I want to show you guys a really interesting technique that you can actually use to very easily, pick apart melody lines and progressions and that kind of thing. So I find it's generally easier, once you already know what the key of the track is, because doing this kind of thing does mess with the key quite somewhat, as you'll see. So what I'm doing here is I'm basically cutting a sample of the segment. So we know that the progression runs over these kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I'm cutting that bit out. And then what I'm going to do is just throw it onto another channel just to make things easier. Double tap on 1 on the keyboard and you'll see my cursor turns into a little clock. And we can use that to time stretch the audio. And then what I want to do is I'm actually just going to do it here and remove what I've made here already just to make things easier. You can actually see I've got the old version here. You'll see what I'm saying in a sec. You'll kind of understand what I'm getting at. So I'm going to create a MIDI clip, and then the idea is to listen. So you'll notice that, once you slow it down, you can much easier hear that movement that synth is doing, as opposed to the original where it's so fast that it's kind of, trying to pick apart that really fast movement is pretty difficult. So now that we've heard that kind of movement, it's much easier to kind of figure out what's happening there. I believe it's going like octave. I'm actually going to do it on an init serum. I think it'll be easier to hear what's happening there rather than all that reverb and stuff. And then that's where it changes key up there. So then let's go, I think it was to the, was it the A? And then it goes up again there. So what we can do is this part, as you'll see, it's only using one note. There's no deviations every second one. So with these note changing parts, it helps to use that one because all those notes will be in key, and then we can shift the kind of accent note to where it needs to be. So if you're not following what I'll basically just copy this across and show you. So then we know here, okay, this one has to change, and we'll find which note is in scale in a moment. Let's just copy all these ones across. And then here it goes up again. I think it was 1, 2, 3 to the D. Okay, so I'm not so sure about that one note that's in there, but you know, for me, like I keep mentioning in my videos, it's a lot easier to see what notes are in scale when it's in the C. So I'm just going to shift these ones up, have a quick look at it. Yeah, everything looks good. Yeah, okay, never mind. It was just me being overcautious. So then, once we've done that, let's just unsolo. We can drop this onto this channel, double tap 1 to bring up the clock again, and then just shift it back into time, and then press 1 again to go back to the normal cursor. So now we've basically, you know, halved the time to listen to the movement of that sequence, recreated it, and then squashed it back into the regular time. Oh, and for those who are wondering, the second sound was actually very similar to the first one. I actually just duplicated it, added a second oscillator to kind of give it a little bit more layers, I guess. I added the filter here to just give it a kind of sweep in the beginning here. But it's essentially the same sound here with just some heavier processing, less of a plucky effect, in fact. This kind of vocal, choppy, gated vocal thing, I've done a video on that. I'm going to post a link in the description. That was done in Phase Plant using a couple of samples and a transgate. And then, you know, pitching those samples to the keys using the MIDI. One thing that we've kind of done repetitively throughout this track is to sequence everything kind of on the root notes of the bass. So it would essentially be loops of this over and over again. However, in these parts where you kind of break it away from that kind of main energy, to create some tension, a really nice trick is to, you know, go with that kind of sequence of the root notes, and then after the, you know, the 4-bar, when your brain kind of expects it to snap back to the F sharp or the C in this one because it's transposed, you change the progression a little bit, and that creates a little bit of tension to lead it into another part. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. I mean, these are just squelch sounds that are going onto like a kind of melody or a progression, so to speak. You know, I try to stay less away from the kind of noisy squelch. So it ends on a note as opposed to ending on a kind of croaky sound, if that makes sense. So it's kind of more pitched up as opposed to the traditional croaky sound, which would be like... Anyway, awesome. Yeah, so the rest of it is me just, you know, messing around with progressions and stuff, trying to come up with these ideas. So I think the, you know, main focus was here, showing you guys those kind of different ideas with the sequencing and the progression. And I think that's kind of like the really, really, you know, powerful, you know, the key thing behind the kind of more, I don't want to say old school because, you know, some people would argue that 2000 isn't really old school. But that kind of, that era of Psytrance, and I think the sequencing was definitely something that we're slowly starting to lose in Psytrance, unfortunately. So, yeah, just put a little bit more into it, you know. If you've got a MIDI sequence and you're copying it over to a new channel, I know I'm guilty of this a lot, but I'm putting it down here so that I can, you know, take by my own lesson and, you know, just, you know, try, vary these things, you know, use, if you're using Cubase, you've got the track versions, so you can always duplicate and edit it and do things and then always jump back to something that you might have preferred, and A/B test between them and all sorts of stuff like that. So, yeah, use the power of MIDI to your advantage. Awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. A big thanks to IDM Mag, proud supporters of the dance music scene and my channel. I'm going to be posting these presets, even though I didn't really go too in-depth with it. I still want to give these presets to my Patreon so they can really quickly recreate these sounds, even though they are pretty simple presets, but I thought you guys would appreciate that. So anyway, if you want to know what the Patreon thing is all about, check out the link that's going to be in the description and hopefully on the screen as well. Yeah, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. See you guys next time.